This is Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
Many of the Christian communities that first embraced the message of Christ are today the targets of unspeakable acts of violence and atrocity.
This is Wretched Radio, and that is Top 10 Stories 7 and 6. That's right, I smushed two together, if you recall, our Top 10 Stories. Number 7 was global persecution. Mm-hmm. But that is also story number 6, because Mike Pence appeared at the Defense of Christians Summit. Why is that a big story? Let's not be confused. Our hope is not in politics. If you listen to this here Wretched Radio program for more than a minute, you know that we're not on about politics. Nevertheless, when we see a man who sure does appear to be a believer in a place of power, well, the people can rejoice.
Nearly 2,000 years ago, the disciples of Jesus left their home country. They left their land, radiating outward from Israel in every direction, bringing with them the good news that is proclaimed to this day.
That's something we can rejoice over, is it not? And so that, I think, is top story number 6, and you're clearly starting to recognize, how did you come up with this order? Never mind that now. Let's move on to the top 5 story du jour for the year 2017, and it is a story I think that we would do well to understand perhaps a little bit better than we currently do. It is the subject of white supremacy, why it exists. Why are we seeing this as such a huge movement in our culture today? Ben Shapiro appearing before Congress to testify on the subject.
The next step in the logic is obvious. If a straight white male or anybody else who ranks lower on the victimhood scale says something contrary to the viewpoint of the higher-ranking intersectionality identity, that person has engaged in a microaggression.
Now, that is a big deal these days on campuses and everywhere in culture, the issue of white supremacy. Where did this come from? Well, as we talked about in 2017, it stems from a worldview that's been around for quite a while. It's called secular humanism. Specifically, if you recall, 17th century, if you like, a group of white European males came up with a philosophy that was abiblical. It's called rationalism, empiricism. It is the age of reason, the age of enlightenment. Well, some people saw some deficiencies in that. They started to critique it, Immanuel Kant for one, and said, some of the benefits, some of the results of this relying on reason business are not so good. Well, there were another group of philosophers who took up the torch of Immanuel Kant, and they said, let's run with this. Therefore, we conclude that these white people who came up with these rationalist philosophies, their consequences are bad. They are all wrong. We cannot rationalize our way to truth. After all, we don't even know if there is truth. Come to think of it, said the postmoderns, there is no truth. And so now, when you hear talk of white supremacy, that anybody who is white, who holds a worldview that appears to be oppressive, or who frankly is just white based on the color of their skin, they're automatically put into that camp and determined to be bad. After all, it was those people during the Age of Enlightenment, the people who founded our country who were white, who oppressed people. They oppressed people because of their skin color. They oppressed people because they wanted a labor force. They oppressed women because they were stronger. They oppressed women because they wanted them barefoot and in the kitchen. Therefore, all things white are deemed to be bad. Now, we can certainly discuss all of that, but we should know where that is coming from. Now, why is that a top 10 story as far as Christians go? Well, because people, when they are taking up, I just saw a story over the Christmas break. The top 10 megachurches in America are run by white males.
Oh, no.
And who are the Protestant reformers? White males. Just pick whatever branch, aberrant or otherwise. The Pope is a white male. Ultimately, this will be aimed at Christians, which leads us to a top 10 story number 4, Bernie Sanders interviewing a man who is he was elected to a pretty, not a real high position, Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Business. He had to appear before Congress, and Bernie Sanders just lit into this guy. Why? Because he's a Christian.
Let me get to this issue that has bothered me and bothered many other people. And that is in the piece that I referred to that you wrote for a publication called Resurgent. You wrote, quote, Muslims do not simply have a deficient theology. They do not know God because they have rejected Jesus Christ, his son, and they stand condemned.
I've never heard such a thing. Christians believe that Jesus is the only way. Now, what happened in this little interview, if you can call it that? It was more like an interrogation. It was more of a determination that Bernie Sanders, who's supposed to be Mr. Tolerant, he doesn't want to tolerate anybody who calls himself a Christian, who upholds the Christian faith to state, if you don't believe in Jesus Christ, then you don't get to go to heaven because there is only one way to get to the Father, and that is through the Son. And so we go through this interrogation. It's painfully long to listen to, but as it comes to a close, this fellow kept trying to defend himself, saying, look, I'm just a Christian, and this is what we've always believed. Bernie Sanders.
That you put into that publication, they do not know God because they've rejected Jesus Christ the Son and they stand condemned. Do you think that's respectful of other religions?
Senator, I wrote a post based on being a Christian and attending a Christian school that has a statement of faith that speaks clearly with regard to the centrality of Jesus Christ in salvation.
I would simply say, Mr. Chairman, that this nominee is really not someone who is what this country is supposed to be about. I will vote no.
Well, then, seems to me that was a religious litmus test, and it's only getting applied to Christians. That was story number 4, just flat out overt anti-Christian attitudes increasing in our country. Story number 3, and these are all kind of mixed and mingled together. You're seeing a theme in this, and really the theme is there's a predominant worldview in our culture, and it's not Christianity anymore. Instead, it is postmodernism, and Jordan Peterson, he professes to be a Christian, don't know much about his profession, professor in Canada, was on the front lines of this because he said, hey, Canada, you can't make a law telling me what I have to say and what pronouns I have to use. And then he went about the business of explaining why these laws are coming about. It goes back to story number 3, postmodernism dominates.
You need to understand postmodernism because that's what you're up against. And you're up against it far more than you know or think. And it's a much more well-developed and pervasive, pernicious, nihilistic, intellectually attractive doctrine than has yet come to public realization. It absolutely dominates the humanities and increasingly the social sciences in the universities. And what's happening, you see, someone once said, who unfortunately I can't remember, it might have been Friedrich Nietzsche, said that everybody is the unconscious exponent of a dead philosopher. And fortunately, the postmodern philosophers, most of them are dead, so that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean that their words aren't continually being spoken by people who are following in their wake, let's say. And it's not like any given person is absolutely possessed, say, by the spirit of postmodernism, because often they're not educated enough to know all the details about what it is that has them in their grip. But if you get 20 of them together, and they're all 5% influenced by the postmodernist ethos, you basically have the spirit of the mob that's a mouthpiece for that particular philosophical doctrine. And if you understand the doctrine, then you understand why things are progressing the way that they're progressing. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the doctrine, because it's not optional to understand this. It's absolutely crucial to understand this. You can't underestimate the power of ideas and also the power of words, of course, because ideas are expressed in words.
And that is why postmodernism needs to be understood. We've spent a lot of time doing that here on Wretched, but we need to understand it because that's what we're up against. Now, that doesn't change anything that we teach or believe, of course. But it at least helps us to go, okay, that I understand, because postmodernism and white supremacy, they're attached at the hip. Oh, okay, that's why they hate God, postmodernism, secular humanism. They are all connected, and a failure to understand that is to simply cause us to be annoyed, and to find the solution in the wrong arena, typically politics. Instead, we need to find our hope in the gospel, which leads us to story number 2 of 2017. Yay, good news! 500 years later, Protestant Christianity, a little sickly in some quarters, alive and well in many others. And it was a pretty big whoop-de-doo. I didn't think it would be, and it was. And that is worth celebrating. But so, too, is story number 1 of the top 10 story of 2017. Happens to be the top 10 story of each and every year. Number 1, no matter how bad it appears to get out there, Jesus still reigns. Okay. Some things never change. Timing and Jesus sovereignly reigning. This is Wretched Radio.